Okay, hello. Uh, my name is Paula, and today I will be giving a workshop. I am on Archcore for Dutch Euros, and I have been debating myself for a few years now. And today I'm going to make a workshop about how to weaponize wordings, different wordings of motions. So this is going to be more beginner slash intermediate oriented. And the point of this workshop is basically to know how to debate motions that don't have conventional wordings. So different motion wordings should be debated differently, even if they are about something very simple. Maybe in the phrasing or the wording of the motion, you can use certain tricks to figure out extension, to figure out framing, to figure out further argumentation. So usually these are kind of like more advanced tricks that debaters that have been, debating for a while figured out, and you can see them that they're using them if you watch debates often. But pretty much what I'm trying to do is I have pulled the most like common mistakes that I have seen debaters make in my experience of debating and judging as well. And yeah, so I think this is going to be helpful for everyone because even some advanced debaters usually miss when it's not so obvious what the trick is. So yeah, this is going to be useful for argument generation, framing, and making extensions. I'm going to start with more simple things, and then I'm going to go into more advanced. Okay, so first example is simple, but sometimes debaters get it wrong. When there is a motion about whether we ought to ban something, that this house would ban something. Like, for example, this house would ban shows, like TV shows that glorify crime, like Peaky Blinders, Narcos, I don't know, Breaking Bad, or this house would ban all drugs. Now, what happens often is that debaters would just assume that this debate is about whether this thing that we are debating about, like whether this thing is good or bad. And debaters will often turn these motions into this house believes that this thing, like X, brings more harm than good. Like this house believes that violent shows or the shows that glorify crime, they bring more harm than good, or things like that, right? And then they would like opposition, especially then, is in disadvantaged position if they don't frame the debate properly and if they don't set up burdens properly, because usually these debates would be about things that are kind of like objectively bad, right? Like, for example, drugs pretty much are objectively bad. It's really hard to argue that like heroin is a good thing, right? Or shows that glorify crime, like pretty much a bad thing, right? It's hard to argue that there is some like utility in society if we, like have shows that are glorifying like, I don't know, people who sell drugs and things like that, right? So, but these motions are not imbalanced if you set them up properly. So what you have to pay attention here is that the motion is worded as we should ban something. And then you ask yourself, well, why did the CA team set it like that? Why is the motion about ban and not about, whether this brings more harm than good? So when we say that we want to ban something, then you want to ask yourself, okay, when does the government ban things? Like, when do we usually ban things? We don't ban things just because they on net bring more harm than good. We don't ban things just because they are not providing any utility to society, right? So what kind of things do we usually ban? We ban things that are harmful objectively to a significant extent. So we ban things that impose danger on the society. Like, for example, you can see that things that are like objectively harmful, but they are not like significantly harmful, such as alcohol, like, right, alcohol, every single research in the world shows that alcohol is bad. No amount of alcohol is safe. We know that alcohol causes, accidents like drunk driving and things like that, but it's still allowed. Smoking also inherently bad for your health. There is nothing good that comes from smoking, genuinely. But we are still allowing these things to exist. Violent video games, for example, they have no real benefit in the society, right? And we still allow them. So then you want to say, and this is the framing you want to set up from the opposition, right? So you want to say that this debate is not about whether violent video shows are good or bad. We don't have to prove that. Our burden is not to prove that violent video shows are on net beneficial. What we need to prove is that they are not so significantly harmful. They do not pose a danger to society. They do not threat the order of the society. And therefore, they do not meet the criteria for a ban. They do not meet a standard that we usually use when we are banning things, right? And then when debate is set up like that, then you are able to win the debate from opposition, right? Because, and it's really important to set up this burden very clearly, like whether you are a member or leader of op, and to push that burden, right? Because sometimes judges even are not gonna, pay attention to this, right? Until if you don't really, lay it out for them, right? Because then that changes the debate. Because if debate is about whether violent video shows, whether they just bring more harm than good, you're gonna lose, right? So that's why it's very important to look at the wording. And why is it that the CA team decided to use the phrasing, we should ban something, when instead of a phrase, this house supports or brings more harm than good? Because CA teams do pay attention to that, right? Like we don't just randomly come up with wording. Like we do understand that different wordings change debate, and we put thought into that. So you can also think about that during preparation time, and it can help you unlock framing, arguments, burdens, and things like that. Now, the second motion is also interesting. So this is the second type that I've noticed people mess up sometimes. And that's when the motion is, we have moral obligation to do something, or somebody has moral obligation to do something. And then sometimes CA teams don't really set up not CA teams, teams in debate don't really set up what moral obligation is, right? Because often what happens in these debates is that teams would just assume that moral obligation is something good, like something that's nice to do, something that's good to do, something that's moral to do, right? But the phrasing is moral obligation. And this word obligation holds a lot of importance for the debate. So let's use the example, this house believes that countries have moral obligation to take in refugees, right? And now teams can debate this. I've seen teams debate this in the way that's we should take in more refugees because they are good for our economy. It can be beneficial for us, right? I have also seen teams debate this by saying that it's kind thing to do, it's a nice thing to do. They are fleeing for war, they're fleeing from danger, and therefore it's a good thing to do. However, this does not fulfill a burden. This does not prove that this is obligation. Just because something is beneficial, that doesn't make it an obligation. Just because something is good to do, just because something is kind to do, that does not make it an obligation, right? So moral obligation, what is moral obligation? Moral obligation means that you have to do something, you have to act in a certain way, or else you are a bad person, or you have violated some moral code that everyone ought to adhere to, and you should, face social repercussions, sanctions, something like that, right? So a good example is, so to make a differentiation between something being morally obligatory, like something being a moral obligation, versus something being morally virtuous. So good example is giving money to charity, right? So giving money to charity is morally virtuous, but it does not constitute moral obligation. So you will be praised as a good person if you're giving away your income and your money to charity, right? We can objectively agree that this is a good thing to do. There is nothing wrong about this. But if you're not giving out your money to charity, unless you're a billionaire, if you are not giving out your hard-earned money to charity, that doesn't mean that you are a bad person. You have not violated any kind of moral obligations, right? So just because something is good and kind to do, that does not make it an obligation, right? So yeah. Or for example, feeding your child as a parent or taking care of your child, not being abusive to your child, that's a moral obligation, because that, if you do not do, you will face some kind of repercussions. Feeding other people's children, that's not your obligation. That's kind to do, but it's not an obligation. So how do you then apply this logic in a debate? So first of all, you need to set up what moral obligation is, right? You need to set up the framing, right? You need to set up what is a moral obligation, and you have to make this differentiation that I just made. What is the difference between something being morally obligatory and something being morally virtuous? And in this debate specifically, what you can talk about, so from the proposition, you can talk about that we have a moral obligation towards refugees because we have a unique ability to help them. Us taking them in means life or death to them, right? So if we don't take them in, if we send them back to their home country, they will probably die, right? Because these are people who are fleeing war or some kind of like political persecution or like something horrible happening in their country. And even though we have not directly caused the war there, we had unique ability to help them. And therefore, if we don't help them and that results in their suffering or death, we are partially to blame for that. And therefore, we have moral obligation to help them. A good analogy of that is saving a drowning child. So if you are, let's say you are on your way to work and you see a child that's drowning and there is nobody around and you are the only person who can help them, it's considered that you have a moral obligation to help them, because if you just continue walking to work, that child will die for sure, 100%, right? So therefore, you will be partially blamed for that. And the same logic can be applied here. The second thing that you can also talk about is that there is a partial responsibility. So obviously the argument that richer countries have caused instability in regions where refugees are coming from, and therefore there is an obligation to help them, right? There is also an argument about, from the opposition, you can really weaponize this obligation phrasing, because if your proposition, right, if the government team does not set this up properly, you can do a very good job figuring out what does the word obligation mean, and you can just tell them that, okay, just because this is a good thing to do, that does not mean that we have an obligation to do this, right? So, and that's how you can set up the debate, that it's very easy for you to win, because if proposition is just explaining why this is important to do, why this is kind thing to do, that doesn't mean that they're fulfilling their burden. And then if you come in OO and you burden push this, you say, okay, you are not fulfilling the burden on proving that this is an obligation of ours, then you can score a lot of points and you can win debate like this. And if you are closing government, for example, and your OG does not, define moral obligation, and they're not really fulfilling that burden, that can be a very good extension, right? So this is how you can use this phrasing. Okay, next example are motions that are this house supports the widespread use of something. And that's like an interesting way to phrase things, because it sounds, so here, like the trick is not as obvious, and you might not be able to, weaponize this or like use the trick all the time, right? Because the widespread use of something just means there is more of that. And then debate is just about whether the thing is good or bad, right? So here I would like to note that you shouldn't get caught up too much into the wording. You shouldn't be like, oh my God, like CAT like has some trick. There is like some secret argument in the framing about widespread use. And if I don't figure it out, I'm going to lose debate or something like that. So usually these debates are just about whether the thing is good or bad, basically. But sometimes you 100% can weaponize this phrasing in your own advantage. So one good example is this House supports the widespread use of economic sanctions as a tool of international diplomacy. And that is a little bit different than this House supports economic sanctions. Now, obviously, a lot of debate and a lot of arguments will be about whether economic sanctions are good or bad, right? And 100% you should have these arguments and you should not change anything about that. However, one trick that you kind of can use here is that widespread use means that you have to characterize so when something is used often, when there is widespread use of something, that means that this is like a trend. This is happening often. And then you need to frame this and you need to explain the importance of that. Because that looks a little bit different. So if I was opposition debating this, I would say that this means we are not talking about economic sanctions in general. We are talking about economic sanctions that are used, the trend of economic sanctions being used very often for every small dispute between countries, using it before diplomacy. So countries that, get into very small disputes and then imposing like tariffs on each other and things like that, that being the first tool in the toolbox before diplomacy, before any negotiations and conversations and things like that, right? So then this strengthens your impacts, right? So you can, if the motion is shallow and you cannot come up with any extension, you can use this, right? It's kind of like cheating, not really cheating, but it's kind of like a hack that's, a little bit sneaky. So you can just use this phrasing to amplify the impacts and to say, like, guys, this debate is not just about whether economic sanctions are good. This is about a trend that we have seen recently, that countries are engaging in usage of economic sanctions to a very significant extent. If you were opposition, you can counterfactual using economic sanctions sometimes, right? Like you can say, we are completely fine with having economic sanctions as a tool in the toolbox that we can use sometimes when there are no other options, no other alternatives. However, what we do oppose is the widespread use of economic sanctions, the trend of countries using sanctions for everything, right? So that kind of like shifts the debate a little bit. It changes the debate a little bit. Okay, next example is very similar. So these are this house supports or this house opposes, however, doesn't matter. There is no difference when you have this house supports or this house opposes. The rise, okay? I want you to focus on the rise here. And then again, often there isn't like a trick or a hack. You are just debating, there is not like a new argument, right? You're just debating about whether the thing is good or bad, right? Because the rise means that there is more of that. However, themes, for example, in the motion, this house supports the rise of the gig economy. This is like a classic old stock motion, and teams would usually just debate whether existence of gig economy or existence of this thing is good or bad. But I think that the word the rise adds additional depth. The rise, like for example, means that this becomes prevalent. This is taking over other industries, like, for example, Uber crowding out taxis. So we have so much gig economy today that we are literally, it's literally crowding out normal business models. And then the problem with this, and this then just amplifies the impacts of why gig economy is bad. Like, for example, you can say Uber drivers, they don't have unions, they cannot unionize, they don't have, good working environment and things like that. So that's why this can amplify impacts. Again, you can use that sneaky extension method, where you can just like say, you're kind of like gaslight the judge and be like, guys, top half is not debating the motion. This is not about whether gig economy is good or bad. It's specifically about the rise. Like, and then you can just use this to like amplify the impact. So even if they took all the arguments, you can just kind of like use this to amplify the impact. And that can be very beneficial for your side. Okay, next example are narrative debates. So one mistake that I've seen debaters do is that they would debate about whether narrative is true or false. So for example, if the motion is, this house regrets the narrative that money can't buy happiness, I would see debaters debate this as, this house believes that money can't buy happiness, period. So one thing that I want to mention here is that sometimes part of the debate will be about whether narrative is true or not true. I will get more into that on the next slide because I have example for the narrative debates. So don't completely discredit that, obviously. But obviously, this debate should be about the narrative and the impact that the narrative has in the society. So not about whether it's true that money can or cannot buy happiness, but what happens when people believe that money can't buy happiness, that there's overwhelming belief amongst the majority in the society, right? So then you can say, and then from there, you can build arguments. But again, it's very important to set this up in framing and then explain, how does this narrative look like? How is this narrative manifesting in the society and things like that, right? So yeah, it's not just about whether this is true. Presumably, most people, I think, would agree that it's not true that money does buy happiness. But what you want to debate here about is how is society impacted just because they believe in this? And then on proposition, you can talk about that this is a bad narrative because this narrative essentially makes people lazy. It's not motivating them enough to, make more money and things like that. It's not motivating them enough to protest for higher wages, to unionize and things like that. On the opposition, you can talk about that it's good to have because vast majority of people are poor. They will never, be rich and have a lot of money. So it's presumably better that they, are able to find joy in life outside of money. So next example, this was set at Euros this year. And I think it's very interesting because this motion had a very bad motion balance. Not because I think this is a bad motion, but because I think that debaters are not weaponizing different phrases of motion enough. So, I mean, I can't complain. I was in OO, which was the best position to be on this motion, but I've been thinking about it. So phrasing is interesting. Phrasing is, this house regrets the narrative that doctors always know the best. And here you have few things to pay attention to. So obviously it's a narrative debate. So we have to not debate about whether this is true or not, but if this is a belief in the society, how do people behave because of this belief? It is a regrets motion, so it's retrospective. It's some kind of trend. And the doctors always know the best. So that always has been presumably strategically put in there to make the motion more balanced for Gov, right? So then if I was Gov, I don't know if this would necessarily work, but what you can do as Gov in this debate is you can play a little bit with this wording to figure out the most strategic counterfactual for your side. So what you can say, yes, that it's true that doctors do know what's the best most of the time, vast majority of time, 99% of the time. So the counterfactual is not going to be RFK. Counterfactual is not going to be people, hating doctors and, people who don't want to go to doctor at all, who go to, I don't know, herbal medicine and things like that. Counterfactual will be that doctors can sometimes be wrong. Sometimes medicine is not the best in solving some issues. Sometimes doctor can be mistaken. When you set up this framing clearly, you're making it much harder for the opposition, because what I got away with in my round is that we just said, okay, counterfactual is RFK and no vaxxers, and like people are not getting vaccination, and children are dying from measles that were extinct. And yeah, and then motion does become very imbalanced. But it doesn't have to be if you are strategic with how you're setting up debate from the opening government. So as I said, from opening government, you can say counterfactual is that doctors can sometimes be wrong. And then obviously you need to justify your counterfactual, you need to explain why this is the counterfactual. And you can say, this is the likely counterfactual because we still believe in medicine. Medicine still has a huge authority. You always go to doctor when you're sick. In vast majority of cases, doctors have been nothing but helpful to you since you were a child. Most people don't have bad stories with doctors and things like that. We are taught in school to believe in science and things like that, right? And also like this medicine is scientific, empirical. This is something that, can very easily be proven to be true. However, there are some rare instances, like fringe cases, where doctors do make mistakes. And that's when we have to keep a light on and think about, okay, maybe my doctor doesn't know the best in this specific case. So what are the situations of that? So, for example, when something is new in medicine, there is not a lot of research. So doctors themselves even don't know what is the best. Like, for example, COVID vaccines. I know that those are like overwhelmingly, especially when they came out, obviously they were important to, resolve the pandemic. We didn't have anything better to deal with COVID, and they were important and things like that. And scientific community and all doctors pretty much are 100% on board that you should get COVID vaccine and things like that. However, now after COVID is over and there have been few years, there is a significant amount of research that is linking certain COVID vaccines with heart-related issues, especially in young men. And that's not like conspiracy theory. That's not like, anti-vaxxer conspiracy. This is documented, scientific. This is true. Like, for example, in Sweden, the use of cardiac medication for young people has increased for 20% since COVID, and that there is specifically link between taking vaccine and having cardiac issue. It's not just from COVID, right? Or it's not at all from COVID. You had to have gotten one of the vaccines. It specifically come from mRNA technology that was used. And that's one example where doctors were wrong, who told people who had cardiac issues that they should get a vaccine, who told people who are not at threat of COVID to get vaccination, and then they got heart issues such as heart inflammation, myocarditis. And these are things that we need to be a little bit skeptical about. Also, if you have a disease that's a little bit rare, that doctors don't know how to treat. For example, if you are a woman who has autoimmune condition, or if you are a patient who, again, has myocarditis, which is a disease that is very different now since COVID, right? It's very important. Doctors, are using old medicine, old journals and things like that, and they might not know the best how to treat you. So then it's important that you can be critical of your doctor. And if your doctor keeps telling you you're fine, and you're not, that you can do a research on your own, find some scientific researches, seek for another opinion, talk to people on Reddit who had the same problem and things like that. This can literally save your life, right? So I've been rambling a lot about this, but what I'm trying to say here is that what's the point of all of this? Debate is not about whether doctors are right or they're not right. Debate is also not about whether doctors are always right, whether they always know the best. Debate is about the belief that people hold. And if you're Gov, you can set up the debate by explaining that doctors are definitely right in 99% of cases. People will still believe in counterfactual that they're right in 99% of cases, but it's good to believe that doctors can make mistakes, because then we hold them to higher scrutiny. Then we are able to criticize them when they make mistakes, which they have been doing. This is not undocumented. Doctors have made mistakes. And that's how you can set up the debate and avoid, debate turning into anti-vaxxers, RFK, and things like that, right? Okay. Okay, so this next example are motions that use phrasing such as always or never, that we should always do something or we should never do something, and things like that, right? The trick that is here is that if you're opposition, you can argue in favor of the thing, but selectively. For example, let's say that the motion is this house believes that teachers should always sugarcoat academic performance, i.e. providing compliments, avoiding scolding. If you are opposition, you don't have to stand against this. You can just say, we can still do this, but selectively, right? We don't always need to do it. We can do this, only when it's necessary. So for example, if you're opposition, you can say that there are situations where we need to be harsh and not sugarcoat things, where kids need to take feedback honestly. And when you are proposition, and that's also very important because here, the word always doesn't affect just framing, but also your arguments. Because in your arguments, it's not enough if you're a proposition, right? If you're a government. In your arguments, it's not enough to just say that it's good to sugarcoat academic performance. You have to explain why this is always an important thing to do. Why always, like even if a child is overly confident, why you should still give them more confidence and sugarcoat their academic performance. Even if child is not taking feedback well, even if child is, not very kind and nice and not listening to you, why in these scenarios you should still sugarcoat academic performance, okay? So then this does affect arguments, not just framing or the setup of the debate, right? One example is that, another example is that this house opposes the narrative that there is no objective moral truth. And then like people who are opposition can be like, oh, well, obviously, I don't know, murdering people for no reason is wrong. Therefore, the motion is wrong. Sorry, if you are proposition. And this is about the narrative. So you have to argue about how this actually manifests in the society and how people actually perceive this. So when people say there is no objective moral truth, nobody actually believes this, or at least majority of people don't believe this in, the way that it's actually like in its absolute, right? So like no one is going to say that things, I don't know, like rape are morally ambiguous, or being a serial killer is morally ambiguous, right? So then you have to be a bit honest with debate. So when people say that they are moral relativists, that means something different, right? Okay. And then example of country of never. So like when there is a phrasing that says never, like we should never do something, like for example, this house believes that countries should never settle their sovereign debt disputes in foreign courts. You can find like one example and win. Just be careful that you are not, if you're like opposition, right? You can just say, we believe that this is good, sometimes, not never, and that's how we're going to fulfill our burden. That's completely fair and valid. The important thing to note here is that you still have to be charitable with debate. So it's unfair to take very like extreme and fringe example that never happens, but something that's like mainstream, something that like happens relatively often or sometimes. Okay. Next example, I didn't know how to put this in a category because it's just a specific motion. It's finals of this EUROS. So the motion was, this house believes that capitalism enhances meaning, something like that, or like a sense of meaning. And so then automatically what can happen if you're not careful with the phrasing and the wording is that you can just assume that this debate is about whether capitalism is good or bad. And then Or you can say that, well, capitalism makes people happy and happiness gives you meaning, and that's it. Like, that's the debate, right? And that's not the way that this should be debated. So what you should be doing is, firstly, figure out what is meaning. How do we define meaning in life, right? Like, what is meaning? Meaning is not just being happy. What does it mean that something enhances your meaning, right? So meaning is not just, being happy and getting stuff and things like that, right? Because, for example, you can say that there are people who are objectively happy. They live in capitalist societies where capitalism enabled them everything they need, like healthcare, money, job stability, and they're miserable. There are high depression rates, high suicide rates, and things like that, right? So these people, they probably don't feel very meaningful. Then you have people who don't live in capitalism or where there is like less capitalism, and they have less, right? Like, they have small salaries, they don't have much in life, but they have meaning. They have something that drives them, something that enhances their value and things like that. They have something to strive for. They have something that gets them out of bed every morning and things like that. So that's why you should be careful about these wordings, because debate is not always about whether something is good or bad. Here specifically, debate was about whether capitalism leads to more meaning in life. Okay. Okay. These are not necessarily manual changes, but like interpretations. In actor motion, so something useful to know. So if there is a motion that's this house as a country should do something, it's on OG. OG has a fiat to set up what do you mean by a country? So do you mean the people of the country or the government? So let's say that the motion is this house says Russia would end war with Ukraine, obviously. And you can set this up by explaining that either like Russian government or people of Russia, right? And whatever OG decides, then debate has to be followed like that. So they have fiat. I mean, this is policy. So they have a fiat, so they get to decide who the actor is. So it's good to keep to pay attention to that. Next is this motion about social movement. So in general, motions about social movement. So and this is very interesting because here's the motion. This house prefers environmentalist movements focusing on a global agenda rather than a local one. Now, most of the debate is about whether it's better to focus, like in general, whether it's better for the environment to focus on global agenda or to focus on local one, right? And obviously, you can make arguments from that. But the question that you can ask yourself is, why environmentalist movements? Is there any other actor who can do this? And then from that, you can come up with additional arguments. It's not like this changes the debate or changes the framing of debate or alters arguments the way that some previous examples did. This can just unlock you another argument. So if you're struggling to figure out extension or something like that. Why environmentalist movements? Exactly. So what you can argue as an argument is that we ought to prioritize what other actors want. So you can say that, for example, from proposition, we ought to focus on global agenda as environmentalist movement because local politicians would deal with local environmental problems on their own because this is the way that they get reelected, right? Global agenda is something that gets less coverage on a global scale because those countries and people who are powerful and who have the most political capital, they don't really feel the effect of climate change and environment, as opposed to local agenda, where, if a dirty is river and, everyone in town gets sick and things like that, right? So there is like more accountability and therefore local politicians have a greater incentive to deal with this. So then you don't need to argue that local agenda is not important. you can just argue that this is something that can be dealt with other actor, and therefore our actor, environmentalist movement, ought to prioritize the global agenda. Another example about about social justice movements or movements in general is this house believes that animal rights movements should focus on converting people to veganism rather than sustainable farming. This is a bit, this motion, similar, it was said many times before, it's pretty stock, but not in this exact wording. So again, teams will often debate about whether one is better than the other. If you would be able to like snap your fingers and turn everyone vegan versus turn all the farms sustainable in the world, which thing is better? But debate is about what animal rights movement should advocate, what they should focus on. Now, social justice movements, and this is like a burden for every single debate about any justice move or any movement that has, and when debate is about whether they should do X or Y, right? Movements don't have magic wand, right? They can just like snap their fingers, and just because they're focused on veganism, everyone turns vegan, or just because they're focusing on lobbying the government to increase sustainable farming or boycotting companies to increase sustainable farming, that will just magically happen. So then debate is not just about which thing is better. Debate is about what is achievable, right? That's another clash within the debate. So for example, if you are Gov, you can talk about all you want, how it would be perfect if everyone turned vegan, or if like a lot of people became vegan, but you need to prove why this is possible, why they have capacity to convert people to veganism, why people have incentive to be converted to veganism and things like that, right? If you are opposition, again, it's not just enough to prove that, you know, it's hard to convert people to veganism. You also need to explain why animals rights movement has capacity to boycott companies, why companies have an incentive to change, and why they have capacity to lobby the government to, you know, lead to substantive change and things like that. Okay, yeah. So another example is this house believes that feminist movement should advocate for carceral punishment. That's when carceral punishment is basically like tough on crime, but for in this case, it's referring to crimes against women or gender-based violence and crimes such as rape. And this part of this debate is whether, you know, being tough on crime and things like that is good or bad, obviously, but it's pretty easy on Gov to argue that, you know, rapists should get long sentences and things like that, right? But then again, another burden here is that whether feminist movement has capacity to achieve this. And how do you weaponize this in debate? So if you're closing government and your OG just talks about why carceral punishment is good, and they don't fulfill the burden why feminist movement has ability to do this, then you can fill it in as extension. If you're opposition, however, you can argue that it's hard to change institutions, courts, norms, and things like that, especially as a feminist movement, and therefore you ought to, you know, focus more on prevention, for example, or like educating people about rape, running anti-rape campaigns and things like that, and that you ought to focus more on other things that you have capacity to meaningfully achieve. Okay, another thing I wanted to discuss very briefly is that sometimes InfoSlide will give arguments. So sometimes CA teams will literally give you arguments in the InfoSlide. So don't always just, you know, just like glance over, brush over InfoSlides. Sometimes you will literally get arguments out of there. Like they will list many examples that you can use for argumentation and things like that, right? Sometimes it's more obvious, right? Like there was that motion, I don't remember exactly what it was at EUDC, that literally listed all the good things in InfoSlide, all the good things China did. And then the motion was something about like this house supports more involvement of China in international community. Like they literally listed like some good things that China did. So sometimes it's going to be very obvious like that. but sometimes it's going to be a little bit more sneaky. So reading info slide very carefully is useful. So this is a very good example. This was a motion at round robin, I think 2021. The info slide is the cult of productivity refers to a set of norms where being continuously productive and busy in both your professional and personal life is seen as desirable and virtuous. Now, if you are a beginner or maybe even intermediate, you might see this and be like, okay, this debate is just about working hard versus not working hard. But what one team in the opening government did is, which I think is very smart and strategic, is they weaponized the info slide, because the info slide says being productive in both professional and personal life. And then they stated that this debate is about being productive in both personal and professional life, which also means like going out with your friends and things like that. Or like, you know, being productive in terms of leisure activities that you are doing. And that the likely counterfactual is being productive only in the professional life, being a corporate rat and things like that. So that framing literally changed the debate, right? So it's useful to read info slides carefully. And that's it for the workshop.